You think about like races, marathons, you've got the picture at the finish line and just is like, wow, look at her, look at him, the accomplishment they had. Again, you don't see it's 10 degrees. I don't want to go out the door and train today, but you make yourself take that first step and you do it. And that's what yields the success.
Welcome to the Corporate Competitor Podcast presented by Forbes Books. I was recently named one of Real Leaders Magazine's top 50 keynote speakers for 2025, which was a huge honor and a reflection of the incredible stories and guests we've been able to share on this show. So let's keep it going. Now, today's guest is Michael Nelson. Michael is the president and CEO of Amway, a global company with more than 14,000 employees and a presence in 100 countries. Michael's story is a remarkable example of growing within an organization. He started as a project intern in 1989 and rose through key roles in supply chain, technology, HR, and strategy over 3 decades. As a dedicated marathon runner, he believes deeply in the power of sports to unite and inspire. So there's a lot we're going to learn from him today. As a reminder, I take notes on my favorite nuggets from the episode and post them at corporatecompetitorpodcast.com/notes to help you apply today's insights. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Don, thank you, sir.
Well, your journey within Amway is fascinating to me, right? You began as a project intern in 1989. I love that whenever you see someone grow within an organization. But in 2024, you stepped into the role of president and CEO. 35 years, incredible. But as you reflect, was there a specific turning point or a challenge that maybe pushed you to climb the ladder, that might have pushed you in your climb? Maybe something or someone that you look back on and say, yes, that moment was really pivotal for me?
Yeah, great question, Don. When I joined the company as an intern, one of the things I think that one of the reasons I wanted to come back was just a really strong culture, kind of rooted in values. And I finished, I was obviously an intern, finished my studies at university and worked at a tech company for a couple of years. And when a role opened up, I came back here. And, as I began kind of navigating my early days, I was in supply chain. But one of the things I think that was unique about our company is I saw people moving into different roles. Perhaps that was a relocation to one of our global markets. It could have been something in a different functional area. And I was always a curious person. I loved learning new things. And so when opportunities would become available, I was kind of always first to raise my hand and, I would just try something different. So, it's somewhat of a circuitous route to where I am today. And I never really focused or intended to climb a ladder, so to speak, but it was just different opportunities that came my way. And it's certainly been a wonderful experience.
So would you say that idea of offering people the opportunity to move into different disciplines, is that cultural? Is that just part of the Amway culture?
It is. You certainly have, as every business does, you've got your verticals. So you have finance and HR and supply chain and technology. But you do see people moving between different disciplines. Some may stay within a vertical. If you're a scientist, you may stay within research and development your entire career.
Right.
But it was very common to see people moving between organizations. And, I think that prepared people for a better understanding in a really collaborative environment.
So one of the things we are always trying to do here is think of those who are listening and what they can take from the conversation. And I would guess that one of the first lessons you might offer here is raise your hand, right?
Yes.
When you said you were always there, you're willing to raise your hand. And that if even if your organization isn't completely aligned with that philosophy, if you see something, raise your hand.
Absolutely. That's one of the things, and I always identify people with their willingness to do that. They're often the people that become the best leaders because they are curious in nature. They are willing to raise their hand and try something new and different.
Wow. Raising your hand. I mean, it doesn't sound overly complicated. I guess it's pretty daring, though, right? Because you could be
Yeah.
very comfortable in your space. But over this career path, you've named off a number of these places already, right? You touch so many areas: strategy, supply chain, HR, technology. You served executive roles in all of those. How did that shape the way you're leading the company today?
I think that provided me with, again, different perspectives of the business where, one of the things we don't often hear at this company is, boy, if technology could just solve their problems, or if HR could just, improve their processes. Because people move between those organizations, it's like, hey, I've been in that role before, and believe me, they have a challenging set of work and responsibilities. And, I think it allows people a much better understanding. And certainly for me, those varying perspectives, I think, helped me understand, of course, different aspects of the company, but always that, we have to work in the collective, that we don't work in silos or functional areas.
One of the other things that I shared in the intro about that's so fascinating is this journey, intern to CEO. I mean, not many companies have that, but I'm wondering, there are business consultants out there, right? We've all read the reports that say hiring a CEO from within means that you're
Um,
too ingrained in the culture to see it objectively. But you're the piece of the puzzle that they claim can't really work. What's the response if you were to be offered that question from some consultant who would say, "Always look outside, new perspective, fresh eyes"? What would your response be?
That's a great question. So, Don, as I think about that, you use the term, culture. I think a company has to ask itself, are you happy with the culture and the values that you have within the organization? Do you want individuals retaining those values? If those can be fluid, I think bringing somebody in from the outside can certainly work. At our company, I think the culture and values are so important that, to me, having an internal person lead the company carries the foundation forward. Of course, strategies and tactics must change and evolve with the times. So you need to make sure you have a leader that not only understands, the foundational values and culture, but has the adaptability to navigate what's happening in the world year after year. But again, I think the answer to that would be, if your culture is important and you've got somebody who has been there, 10, 20, 30, 35 years, you're likely to have somebody that has authentically lived out the values of the organization. And of course, you would look at the competency of, are they strategic? Can they adapt? But it's the combination, I think, of those two.
I love that idea that obviously the power of an internal candidate. But the opening line you had there, a company has to ask itself, are you happy with the culture as it exists today? And if you
That's
are,
right.
why go outside? Why risk some of the things that could come from that, especially if you've got a wonderful candidate internally?
It was interesting, Todd. I right when I was, had been asked by our board of directors to step into this role, and obviously it was an incredible honor for me. I think Nike was going through their transition as well and brought in, and it was almost eerily similar. Elliot Hill, intern, I think 32, 33 years ago, had navigated his way through Nike. I believe he had retired, but they brought him back to lead the organization. And the number one reason also was they wanted to reinstitute the culture and the essence of what that brand was.
Well, and it was a pretty tough time for Nike when he walked back in. I mean, obviously
Very
they
much
made
so.
a couple of big choices that had taken him in the opposite direction.
That's
No
right.
question. Love it. So I'd love to ask you. I want to, as you know, in this podcast we talk a little bit about athletics,
Yes.
and I'm excited to get into that with you because I understand that there's a baseball story from your childhood
Oh,
that still makes you laugh today.
oh,
Would you
somebody
say?
gave you some intel.
We do a lot of research before we jump onto these podcasts.
Gotcha. So my father, who, grew up in the 1940s, and obviously baseball was ubiquitous at the time. I mean, it was
Right.
the national pastime, and he was such a baseball fan. He played the game, loved the game, just was a devout follower. And so when I got to like little league age, of course, I was signed up immediately. He was the coach, God bless him. And um, I had let me just tell you, very, very bad eyesight and, perhaps not great talent then for ball sports, but I can remember standing in the batter's box and, I'd be ready and strike, and I didn't see a thing. And so then I would just swing. And, afterwards, my dad was like, he hadn't thrown, basically, I completely missed it. And my dad would put me in the outfield and, balls would come, obviously, sky balls coming out to the outfield. And I mean, not a chance. And so, after I think I lasted a year or two, but my dad, I think, resolved himself to the fact that he was not going to have a great baseball player in the family and
You
said,
weren't the
son,
future Willie Mays.
yeah, son, stick to running. I remember I was definitely a runner. I was a very skinny kid, but I could run and I could run forever. And I remember he would make, I don't know if you recall ditto machines, but I remember like they would come out like in blue, almost the paper, and they had
Almost like
this,
Xerox, but yeah, like original,
it
but
was
way back.
pre-Xerox,
Right,
and
and
it
they
was, you'd crank them out,
crank
and
them
it was
out. Yep.
these ditto machines, and he would give me, he called it calisthenics at the time, but, different, like run a mile, run 800s, and, and I would begin checking the boxes on each of those. I'm sure that ink was probably toxic, but
Probably. Hopefully, you didn't get too much of it on your skin, but that's okay.
well, I'm still going at least. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So, you grew up in Cincinnati, you moved to Boston and then Michigan, right? But one thing remained constant was this passion for running, right?
Yes.
So, through all these moves and the countless marathons that you've completed,
Mhm.
what has running taught you about leadership?
For me, one, running is definitely an outlet. It's quiet time, and I think everybody needs margin in their schedules, and that's one of the few times I have for me, it's for prayer and for planning and things like that. But I guess in one word, it would be discipline, that
Mm,
you have to be very disciplined. I mean, if you're training for a race, and of course, early on, it was 5Ks. And then as you get a little older, you move up, typically 10Ks, half marathons, marathons. Um, but training for any of those distances requires a lot of discipline.
mm.
Living here in Michigan, where I
A
spent most of
serious
my
amount of
years,
discipline. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, just getting out the door, some days you look in the winter going, oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, it's so cold out there, or there's lots of snow, but it's just the discipline. Take a step, and typically that step, um, you go out on your run. I don't think I have ever come back saying, boy, I wish I wouldn't have done this. It was always, you've got that great feeling that you've finished.
But I love it. You said your first, no matter what it looks like outside, the first thing you have to do is
Take that
take a
first
step.
step.
Right.
Just get out the door. My wife's a runner as well, and I literally have to push her out the door. I'm like, honey, you always come back and you're happy, but you got to go. She's like, it's way too cold. And, it's like, go. And then she comes back. She's like, oh, thank goodness I did that.
So, so make the leadership transition for me. How do you use those disciplines, this idea of take a step, this, that importance of quiet time as you're talking and navigating the teams that you're asked
Yeah.
to provide inspiration to. How do those things translate into content that you're sharing with them?
Great question. I think, again, that discipline provides you, at least for me, the running provides me time to plan, time to think through what the right messaging should be, enough margin where you do get that thinking time. I mean, I believe some people have this, hey, I work 24/7, my schedule's, book from day to night. And, I think all of us as leaders have to have that time where we're truly planning, and then allowing that to then inform, as you're meeting with teams, you're well prepared. You always come ready to listen, but you've come prepared as well.
So I love that you need to have margin in your schedule. I love that
Mm.
line that you said earlier, and that you're right. Too many people, it's almost a
A
badge of
pride.
honor. It's a
Yeah,
badge of honor to say, "Oh,
right.
look at my." I had someone just do this yesterday. I was talking to him
That's
about
right.
a potential date to have a conversation, and they flipped to that date on their phone and then proceeded to show it to show me how busy they were, and
Yeah.
I was like, "Okay, I get it.
Yeah. And of course,
We're
we
all
all
that.
have those
We all have
days,
that,
but
right?"
yeah, if you do that 365 days a year, you're not going to have a lot of time to plan and strategize on what comes next.
So, um, is there been? I know you're reasonably new to the CEO role, but has there been in all of these journeys across the running has been a constant? Has there been a decision, a thought, something that's occurred to you when you had the clarity and the margin, as you said, to
Yes.
kind of get out of the schedule? Has there been something that maybe tell me a story where
Huh.
something that's come up in one of those runs has translated into something that you've been able to do or lead?
Yeah, interesting. And maybe I'll use a very recent example. I'm just returning yesterday from a trip to China. We were kind of throughout the country and multiple different cities. And, again, each morning you're a bit jet lagged, of course. And so, typically when I wake up, if you lay there and you can't fall immediately back to sleep, I just get up. And I thought, well, now's the time to run. And the weather just was exceptional there last week, so I could run outside and in all of these cities. Um, that's typically in the middle of the night, so the traffic's not bad. You can easily navigate, through some of these larger cities. Um, but what it did, I had multiple media interviews over the full week that I was there. Of course, multiple meetings with our team, which is just an exceptional team over there. And each morning, it allowed me to plan out that day. They prompt you with some kind of media questions, but you've got to be ready for anything. And so, I typically try and study a little bit before I go out for a run, and then have that time to really consider if it's a meeting with an employee meeting with Amway China employees. I kind of have my thoughts
Mhm.
organized. Same with the media that, I understand the prepared questions, but I got to be ready for anything that comes my way. And, over there, typically they use about 10% of what had been prepared, and then it's 90% on what they want to dive into.
I love it. But you're in that running period. You're not busy looking down for potholes. You're busy literally working potholes in your mind, right? Like
Yeah,
what
I
could
do
be
have to do both, but yeah.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
One of the things we love to ask guests because we think it's important. I get a chance to do a lot of corporate speaking engagements, and one thing that comes up often is I hear executives talk about their teams, right? The
Mm.
team, I'm leading this team.
Mm.
But when you really dig in, they're not a team. They're teams, I know teams. There are a bunch of people who have the same business card, but that's it, right?
Yes.
So I'd love to ask leaders like you to coach me or listeners. If you were suddenly handed a group of people
Mm.
that are all over the place and you're trying to pull them together to achieve something that only a team can achieve, give me the first few things that you would think I as a leader need to focus on.
Culture and the values, you've got to set a foundation with that group of individuals and assess, do they all and authentically, and that's a key word,
Mm,
authentically demonstrate those values? Because I think that is what any highly performing, effective team first and foremost has. That if you have one superstar and that person just wants to be the hero of everything, they're likely not going to play on a team. They may be just vastly superior, just an exceptional talent, but if they cannot play truly as a team, the team is likely not going to do well. And we've seen multiple examples of that in many, many different sports, and certainly at companies, I think, as well. But if you have a team that really understands the foundation, then it's, again, looking at those, the strategies and plans and tactics that you're putting in place, and those individuals having a willingness to be adaptable, and then a willingness to celebrate the successes of
mm,
others as well. That if it is just all about them, certainly at our company, those people typically don't last very long. We look for people, we look for servant leaders, we look for people that, celebrate and cheer the success of others. And again, that's where it kind of lifts all ships. So as a true team, you are highly performing if you've got, every individual on that team doing that.
mm. You used a word earlier. You actually even made reference to the fact that it was unique. The idea of do they all authentically demonstrate the
Yes.
values? How do you as maybe a new leader, they're new folks to you, right? They may
Sure.
be a collection. How do you determine that authenticity?
Yeah. And again, I think every company, different sports teams, you see on the wall, when you walk into the corporate lobby, you'll see, here are our values.
Values, right?
Yeah. And so you can say, yeah, we have those values. And then, you've got to have a leader over a team assessing, well, do those people, does the feedback that I get on these individuals, does it align with what those values say?
Mm.
If that isn't happening, that authenticity is not there.
Before we continue, I want to remind you that if one of your 2025 goals is writing a book, but you don't know where to start, I'm here to help. In my new role as publisher at Forbes Books, I'm working alongside a world-class team to guide aspiring authors like you through the process of getting published. Whether it's a story, a big idea, or a project close to your heart, now's the time to make it happen. Just visit forbesbooks.com/Don to get started. I love that. Yeah, I remember many years ago as a journalist, I was assigned to do a story about Enron, and I remember walking in. This is before Enron imploded, obviously,
Oh
walking
boy.
into their corporate headquarters in Houston, and there on the wall stood their company values, and number one was integrity. And
Of
I loved it,
course,
right?
yes.
Because
Yeah.
sometimes you could put those values up there, but they mean absolutely nothing when we're really doing it.
That's a great example. Yeah.
It's not what we say, it's what we do.
Yes.
So marketplaces change greatly, especially over 3 decades as you've been around. I shared with you earlier that my parents were Amway distributors when I was a
Yeah,
kid growing up, and
fantastic.
my mother loved the products. My father loved the cassette tapes, right? The
Yes.
cassette tapes, and probably there are listeners here who don't even know what a cassette tape is, but cassette tapes of leadership because he was such a junkie and made me a leadership junkie as a result. So it's a much different world communicating with your business groups today. Though that was such an amazing part of what Amway did, right? You guys were really a leadership development company that just happened to have products on the side. Um, uh, as a leader, you have to look at change from a perspective of advantage, not one of
Yes.
distraction. And you had to adapt and embrace change. Um, what advice would you give listeners who are struggling to adapt to and embrace change?
Yeah, again, I think if you have you have to bring clarity to here is our foundation. Here are the values that we have. These are the things that are timeless. These are the things that will not change. Beyond that, again, when you get into strategies and objectives and tactics, you had better be adaptable to what's happening in the world. You have to have, great insight. You have to have the data that says how are we performing as an organization, based on peer sets or based on, what other successful companies are doing, and then constantly challenge yourself. So if you're not able to be adaptable to change, you're likely to be, extinct pretty quickly. You really do need to have that ability to identify what are the opportunities and then understand how you evolve your organization. But again, defining what should never change, what should be timeless with, basically everything else that you need to be prepared for is important.
Timeless versus everything else. I love
Yeah.
that. The phrase when I think about the question as I was positioning it for you that it really stood out to me. It's not just adapting to change, right? It's about embracing it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's about saying, "Hey, yes, this is what we did, and this is how we did it, and it's cool."
Yeah,
As important as leadership development remains, we have to deliver it differently because we have to embrace what's happening out there
that's
today.
right.
How do you create that culture to embrace it?
Yeah, that's a good one. I would say you have to celebrate when you have successful, changes, things people didn't necessarily expect would, hit a home run for the company, really celebrating those. At the same time, Don, I think when a company has a failure, but you got some tremendous learnings out of that, that
Mm,
help to stimulate ideas and thoughts for let's try something different next time, celebrating that as well. So, not having a culture where people are so panicked to fail that it's only the successes get celebrated, the people who are successful get celebrated. Um, but when somebody tries something, perhaps it's a failure, but you glean what are the things we learned from that we can, look to incorporate to continue to adapt for the future.
Is there a is there a failure? I love that, right? That idea that
Yeah.
you can celebrate a failure if you learn from it.
Yeah.
Is there a failure that you've experienced in your journey to leadership that you've applied that method to that you might tell us a little story about?
There's probably been many over 35 years. As I think about when I stepped into the role leading our technology team, we had a great team, but we were having significant challenges with implementation of a global system that we were putting in place. And typically with those global systems, you have to identify, what is standard and, what can every market kind of adapt. And we took an approach initially that, you had to have a very standard application, but this was really customer facing and for us Amway business owner facing. So we had to relax that a bit, as opposed to saying, 80% of it's going to be a core offering. We had to relax that a bit so the nuances of market by market, people could adapt to. So we came up with, initially this push of, here's how it's going to be. We gave more flexibility, and I think the end result was much more positive.
Which has got to be true if you're operating in 100 countries, right?
Yes,
I mean, it's got to
exactly.
be like what the way things are and the challenges we face are different.
Yeah, the nuances are vast.
Nuances are vast. Love it. So you used one of my favorite words in the very first answer you gave, because I've been studying leadership for a while, and I found curiosity, right, is one of the most significant traits of every great leader I've ever been around. High CQ, right? Curiosity quotient. The beauty of curiosity is that if you possess it and you express it, it signals to others that you do not know all the answers.
Yes.
And that you have the self-confidence to go in search of them, which hopefully will inspire them to do the same. How do you maintain your willingness to learn? How do you maintain your curiosity as you've continued to rise? Because sometimes leaders are afraid, oh my gosh, if I'm perceived as someone that doesn't know the answers, that's what they come to me for, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a concern of many, certainly newer leaders, but even leaders that have quite a bit of experience, is that they believe they have to have all of the answers. And again, with how dynamic our world is, nobody can have all of the answers for everything. And that I think curiosity is always saying, I not only don't have all the answers, I'm willing to listen and to find and to explore different thoughts, and, bringing people together, bringing your teams in down and having just open discussions. I typically, what are kind of the rules for my meetings? I don't sit in front of PowerPoints and just have people read to me, a 30-page PowerPoint slide. But it's, hey, if you've got that information, send it in advance. But we're going to have a discussion, and it's an open discussion. I want everybody participating if possible. And, I typically, I learned early on, be one to ask many different questions, not just talk and pontificate on all the things I think I know, but I think that comes from a bit of that curiosity approach as well. Just the ability to ask questions.
Is there a go-to question for you? If somebody's giving you a presentation, is there something you like to, I don't know. I mean, I'm just throwing it out there. Like, I've met some people, we just had Alan Mullally from Ford and Boeing on recently, and he has a couple of go-to questions. So I didn't know if you might have one.
A lot of times I will ask, people, if they're coming in with a proposal, you often ask what might make this not work? What are some of the things that could create challenges? So you want to make sure people have really thought through all of the different aspects of what they're bringing in. And then I often ask as well, who all did you engage with to come up with this conclusion or proposal, whatever that might be? Because I really prefer that we have individuals that this is not their individual thought, but they've gone through that vetting process with multiple other people to get that input.
I love that. So you're challenging them to make sure that they're bringing you a collective response, or a collective opportunity, not just one that they've managed themselves.
Correct.
But secondly, you're also seeing, have they thought through the process long enough to figure out what could go wrong?
That's right.
Wow. Love it. Very good. So you've run marathons all over the world. But what's it like to be part of a race that has such deep roots in your own community, like the Amway Riverbank Run there in Michigan?
Amway is the title sponsor for the Riverbank Run, as you said. We've got different distances. This is a 10K, a 5K, 10K, and a 25K. And it used to be the national championships for the 25K.
Wow.
But for me, what this does is, gives the community, and we get people from all over, just gives the community an opportunity to really focus on health and well-being. And that's really what our company is all about. I moved from being a participant in those events to now I really just volunteer each year because it's incredibly fun to see people setting a goal, reaching a goal, whether that they finish the 5K, they finish the 10K, or went to the longer 25K distance. It really is. It's fun to be on that side of it where I'm not the runner, but I'm the one supporting.
Awesome. I will have to, ask anybody I know that runs that race to find out if there's a day when they come by and you hand them a glass of water or hand them a cup of water. That'd be awesome.
They'll see me. Yeah.
So I know how important listening is in the creation of relationships and of being a great leader. Who's the best listener you ever encountered?
Oh, probably the best listen. Well, I may make that plural. It's probably my grandparents on my maternal side. They're from Boston. We have a big family in Boston. My grandfather was the eldest of 12. So, lots of, cousins and aunts and uncles. But they were incredible. And I'll start with not just listener, question asker. They would ask everybody, questions. They didn't talk much about themselves unless, there was a question of them. They were always, and again, it goes back to what you were saying, Don, the curiosity. They loved hearing stories of people. And what was interesting is they became probably two of the best storytellers that I have ever known. They could weave, just these fantastic stories, but it's because they were listeners. They would listen and, people loved being with them because, one, I think people enjoyed talking about themselves and they would sit and listen and just continue to ask questions. And what's funny is a lot of times there was like nothing reciprocal. And you just think, again, people, they do love to talk about themselves. But they were probably the two that were the best listeners I can think of.
Boy, that's powerful. And what a great to have just been in the room for you, right?
Oh,
There's a master class going on there.
it was
And
indeed.
it's just a couple of grandparents having a fun conversation.
That's right.
Wow, love it. So, in conversation with a lot of other championship performers, many of them will tell you that someone who they often thought of in challenging moments, there's someone out there that's important to them when they're pushing beyond what's required. They're doing it for someone, right? I'm just wondering, as a runner, as a leader, as a CEO, do you have that vision? Do you think of someone like that you're doing it for? And how does that play into the way that you inspire your own self, right? We have to inspire others, but we have to inspire ourselves too.
Yeah, that's a good one. There's probably not a single individual. I'll be honest, typically when I'm doing races, and certainly in the marathon distance, it's an endurance event. I'm a Christian. For me, it's just, kind of running for the glory of God. And really, that's my inspiration for me. And, helping others along the way, you'll invariably see people struggling and, just a quick comment, on, hey, you can do it, keep going. Those are the kind of things, and celebrating with people at the end as they're reaching their accomplishments. So, but that's probably consistent inspiration for me.
I love that idea of just here you are running your own race, but you've got to stop there and maybe offer a moment of inspiration for someone else.
Yeah.
That's pretty darn awesome.
Mm.
You know, I'm going to ask one last question. In
Okay.
30 years in journalism, I asked a single question of almost every great champion I had a chance to work with, and that is, could they identify one habit that they believe allowed them, a daily habit that allowed them to separate themselves from competitors, something that they did on a regular basis that gave them, in their mind, a competitive advantage? What would that habit be? If you've got something that is a part of your daily routine that you believe gives you an kind of a little extra strength, what might that habit be?
Yeah, I'd probably sum it up, Don, as um, consistency, discipline, and taking that first step. Again, for me, um, anybody who is successful is one, and we read about, athletes that, just they practice for hours a day. If, they're shooting free throws, it's just over and over and over while nobody's watching. And again, it's that consistency and discipline. Clearly, as you think about like races, marathons, you've got the picture at the finish line, and it just is like, wow, look at her, look at him, the accomplishment they had. Again, you don't see it's 10 degrees. I don't want to go out the door and train today, but you make yourself take that first step and you do it. And that's what yields the success down the road.
Mm. And I love the consistency question there because, I love it. Consistency compounded over time equals credibility, right?
You bet.
If you're consistent and everybody knows what to expect from you, there's a
Absolutely.
credibility that comes with that. Michael, I've loved it today. I've got pages and pages of notes all over I was scribbling on every piece of paper I had because
Well, it was a
there's so
pleasure,
much to
Don.
take.
Yeah.
I enjoyed our time, and I thank you today for being a corporate competitor with us.
Well, thank you, sir. And, thank you for all you do. I've read, your books and your many articles in Sports Illustrated over the years. So it was a pleasure to get a chance to speak with you.
Man, I have to tell you, that was fun for me because it was a very full circle moment, right? It was that opportunity to have kind of gotten back and in touch with an organization that had impact on my life as a young person. But I took a whole bunch of really great nuggets from the conversation, but there were three that when I tried to whittle them down, I thought would be an absolute great takeaway for all of us. Number one was that entire anecdote at the beginning about how he moved from so many different places within the organization over his 35 years. But the key to that was his level of curiosity, which was high, and his willingness to raise his hand, right? And he argues that those who raise their hands make the best leaders. So, great lesson. Opportunity exists. You see something that might not be in your complete sweet spot, but a place for you to grow. Raise your hand. The second thing that I really loved was when he talked about running and its importance to him and what it provided to him. He talked about the idea that every leader needs margin in their schedule. And what he uses that running time for is margin, right? It's that opportunity to clear his mind, to think, to pray, to even craft messaging as he's thinking about what reporters could be asking him while he's in China. And then the third is really the greatest takeaway for me, and that was how organizationally and individually he embraced change, how he knew it's the one constant, right? Constant. He said that when you look at what your organization does and stands for, look at it in basically two categories: timeless values, timeless things that shouldn't change, right? That your culture and other pieces, and then everything else. And everything else is available for change, right? That's where you use your data. That's where you use what your competitors are doing to try to start thinking about how we need to change, but not just because we have to, because we want to, because we need to. It's part of embracing change. He talked about celebrating successful changes, right? When things had gone well. But then I loved it when he said, you also want to celebrate your failures, especially if you've learned something, right? Celebrate those things because that allows you to grow. I'm better. I'm better for this conversation today. I hope you are as well. I appreciate you. Like, this kid could suck and we don't care because he's a Broncos fan.